Hey guys, tonight we're taking a step back in time to one of the more unforgettable jobs of the medieval world. Picture it. It's early morning, the air smells like decay, and you, my friend, are already waist deep in something you'd rather not deal with. No, I'm not talking about a bad job interview. I'm talking about being a gong farmer, the person responsible for cleaning up all the bodily waste that your fellow medieval townsfolk have left behind. Now, before you get too comfortable, let's be real. You probably won't survive this job if you had to do it yourself. I mean, imagine spending your days scooping up waste from the streets, hauling it away, with nothing more than a spade and a bucket. Yeah, not for the faint of heart. But hey, before you get too grossed out, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead, drop your location and the time in the comments. Let me know how late or early you're watching. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's talk about a medieval job. You definitely wouldn't want being a gong farmer. Medieval cities were, to put it mildly, a disaster. When it came to sanitation, streets filled with human waste, livestock roaming freely, and public places that were used for, well, everything. And who's left to deal with all that? You, the gong farmer. But it's not just a job. It's a survival tactic. Without people like you, the whole town would have collapsed under the weight of its own filth. But here's the thing. It wasn't even a respected job. In fact, it was probably one of the lowest of the low. Think about it. Your job is to deal with all the things nobody else wants to touch. The smell alone would knock anyone out. But you're the one who has to wade through it. And your only tools, a spade, a bucket, and a willingness to dive into the muck. Yeah, glamour is not the word I would use for this. The medieval streets weren't just filled with people. They were filled with waste, human waste, horse dung, trash that could pile up for days on end. And you, as a gong farmer, were the one to get rid of it all. Sure, it sounds disgusting, because it is, but without you, the city would be covered in filth, and life as they knew it would have ground to a halt. Historians still argue whether this job was as bad as it seems. Some say it was essential without gong farmers. The spread of disease would have been far worse. Others claim it was just another grim task that only the poorest of society had to endure. Either way, it's clear that without you, the medieval world would have been in a lot of trouble. So, while you weren't exactly receiving a medal for your service, you were, in some strange way, the unsung hero of medieval sanitation. Now, let's get into the details of what exactly it meant to be a gong farmer. It wasn't just a job. It was a lifestyle. You weren't the guy with the shiny armor, the one riding off to battle, or managing the local bakery. No, you were the one people tried to avoid, and you weren't invited to any fancy feasts. That's for sure. Your job, well, it was as straightforward as it gets. Scoop up the waste, haul it off, and repeat. No fanfare, no recognition, just a daily grind of scraping through the dirt, mud, and filth of medieval life. But hey, someone had to do it, right? You weren't exactly walking into this role with a glowing resume. Being a Gong farmer usually meant you came from the bottom rungs of society. And if you weren't born into it, the alternative was often far worse. So, you made do. Your tools were simple. Nothing more than a spade, a bucket, and a pair of stout boots to help you brave the muck. And oh, the muck, imagine scooping up waste that had been left out in the open air for far too long. It was part of your daily reality. If it was a particularly rainy day, well, you could count on the streets being even worse, as the mess would wash into the gutters, mixing with the already smelly atmosphere. You had to be quick, efficient, and as unbothered as possible to get the job done. Now, let's talk about the real job, the gong. The term Gong farmer comes from an old word for cesspits, or what we would now call toilets. These pits were dug into the ground, often right outside people's homes or in the backyards of buildings. The problem was that these cesspits quickly filled up, and without a modern waste disposal system, you needed someone to dig them out. Enter you, the brave and probably underpaid Gong farmer. Historians still debate the true scope of the job, whether you were just cleaning up after the locals, or whether you were also digging and maintaining these cesspits. Some argue that the work was strictly removal, scooping up and carting away the waste to designated dumping grounds, far away from the homes and businesses. Others believe that it wasn't as simple as just hauling waste. You had to be a part-time plumber, maintaining the cesspits to make sure they didn't overflow or cause other sanitation issues. Either way, it was a messy job that no one wanted, but you still had to do it. And of course, it wasn't all that easy. Once you collected the waste, you had to figure out what to do with it. If you were lucky, you could dump it outside of town into an area specifically designated for waste. But it's not like there were designated landfills at this time. More often than not, you were throwing it into a pit or field and hoping it didn't seep into the local water supply. What a delightful thought, right? You weren't alone in this, though. You worked alongside others who were in the same grim position. Your colleagues were typically other lower-class laborers, people from the bottom rungs of medieval society, who were just trying to survive. You were seen as essential, but not celebrated. You kept the city from being completely overrun by filth, but you were always the last to be acknowledged. And while you worked with others, it didn't make the job any easier. It was still filthy. It was still miserable. The people in the higher classes, they never got their hands dirty. It was left to you and others in your position to handle the waste while they went about their day, likely never giving a second thought to the grim task that kept their streets clean. But hey, at least you were doing your part to keep the city from becoming a cesspool, literally. Historians still argue whether or not there was any, appreciation for your job. Some suggest that townspeople were more than happy to avoid the job, but secretly grateful for the Gong farmers who kept the streets clean. Others believe that the stigma surrounding the work was so strong that the farmers were completely marginalized, with little to no recognition for the importance of their role. Either way, you were likely stuck in the muck and mire, forgotten by the people you helped, and not often given the respect you deserved. By now, you're probably getting a sense of just how rough it was to be a Gong farmer. But what makes the job even more grueling, beyond the obvious filth, was the sheer danger involved. It wasn't just about dealing with human waste all day. There were other threats lurking, that no one talked about, things that could get you killed if you weren't careful. So, as you went about your day, scooping up waste and dumping it into whatever pit you could find, you were constantly aware of the lurking dangers. Let's start with the most obvious one: disease. We're talking about an era where the concept of germs hadn't even been dreamed up yet. There was no understanding of how diseases spread, so people went about their daily lives surrounded by filth, unaware that they were constantly exposed to deadly bacteria. As a Gong farmer, you were on the front lines of this grim reality. You were literally swimming in germs. Handling waste meant you were constantly at risk for diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever. These were common and often fatal diseases that spread quickly in unsanitary conditions, and you were knee-deep in the very thing that fueled them. Historians still debate how much the sanitary conditions of the time contributed to the spread of these diseases. Some argue that the lack of basic sanitation was a primary factor in the rapid spread of the plague, while others believe that medieval people were already resilient to the bacteria due to their constant exposure. Regardless, as a Gong farmer, you had little protection from this unseen enemy. There were no gloves, no masks, no antibacterial soap, just you, your spade, and a whole lot of waste. And, of course, the risk of getting sick was ever present. Then, there was the matter of rats. These little creatures were the real pests of the medieval world, carrying diseases that could wipe out entire towns in a matter of days. As a Gong farmer, your daily work was essentially an open invitation for rats to come and scurry all over you. Not only were they attracted to the waste you were collecting, but they also carried the fleas that spread the plague. So, while you were busy scooping up filth, you were also surrounded by these disease-ridden pests, making your job even more perilous. Historians still argue whether rats were the primary vectors for the Black Death, with some claiming that fleas on rats were to blame for the plague's rapid spread, while others suggest that human-to-human transmission played a larger role. Either way, the fact remains, rats were your unwelcome companions, and their presence only added to the already dangerous conditions you were facing. But it wasn't just disease and pests that posed a threat. Gong farmers had to deal with the very real risk of accidents. When you're working with open pits filled with waste, the chance of falling in was high. Imagine the horror of slipping into one of those cesspits, surrounded by years of accumulated human waste. The thought alone is enough to make your stomach churn. But for medieval Gong farmers, it was a daily reality. And once you fell in, there was no quick way out. The muck would cling to you, and the chances of contracting some deadly infection were sky high. Falling in wasn't just embarrassing. It could be life-threatening. Some historians speculate that the constant threat of these accidents led to the development of certain social norms around cleanliness and bodily functions, though it's not entirely clear. What is clear, however, is that the work was both physically and mentally exhausting. It was a job that wore you down day after day, not just because of the filth, but because of the constant fear of what might go wrong. And then, of course, there were the attitudes of the people around you. You weren't exactly a popular figure in town. Gong farmers were often seen as the lowest of the low, and most people gave you a wide berth, not wanting to be near you or your tools. The stigma surrounding your job wasn't just about the work itself. It was about what it represented. In a society where cleanliness was next to godliness, your job symbolized everything that was unholy and unpleasant. No one wanted to touch the stuff you dealt with, but everyone relied on you to make it disappear. Historians still argue whether this stigma was worse for Gong farmers than for other lowly professions. Some claim that it was one of the most scorned jobs in medieval society, while others argue that other laborers, like those working in the tanneries or the butchers, were just as despised. Either way, there's no denying that your role as a Gong farmer meant you were constantly looked down upon, even though your work was absolutely vital to keeping the city from descending into complete chaos. So, while you may have been doing something essential, there was little reward for it. You weren't celebrated. You weren't even thanked. And if you were lucky enough to survive the dangers of the job, you were left with little to show for it, beyond the knowledge that you kept the city clean and, to some extent, saved lives. But the respect and recognition you deserved, that was hard to come by. And yet, despite all the hazards, despite the stigma, despite the daily grind of working with human waste, you kept going. Maybe it was the sheer necessity of survival. Maybe it was the lack of options. But whatever the reason, you trudged through the streets, shovel in hand, doing a job that no one else would touch. And maybe that's what made you stand out, your ability to endure. While others may have run from the muck, you were the one who faced it head on. Now that you've got a sense of just how physically and mentally grueling the job was, let's talk about how medieval towns handled it. Or rather, didn't handle it. In a world where public sanitation was, for lack of a better term, non-existent, you were often left to your own devices. Think about it. You, the Gong farmer, were expected to work in these horrific conditions with little to no assistance from the local authorities. Sure, there were some rules in place. Well, sort of. But for the most part, you were out there alone, dealing with the filth and the danger with little support. Medieval towns didn't have the luxury of modern plumbing. There were no underground sewage systems, no garbage trucks picking up waste every week. Instead, the waste you collected went into cesspits, deep, dark pits dug into the ground, where human waste, animal dung, and other refuse were dumped. These cesspits were often located near homes or public spaces, and the conditions were, let's be honest, disastrous. In fact, many of these pits would fill up quickly, and then it was up to you, the Gong farmer, to deal with it. But here's the kicker. There weren't even standardized methods for how you were supposed to dispose of it. Sometimes, you'd cart the waste off to a field outside of town, dumping it in a pit. Sometimes, you'd find a spot far away from the main roads, hoping that the wind would blow the smell in the right direction. And let's not even talk about the problem of waste seeping into the groundwater, contaminating local drinking sources. Many towns didn't have the faintest clue that their lack of sanitation was creating a ticking time bomb of disease. Historians still argue over just how much impact early medieval sanitation had on disease outbreaks. Some say that without the Gong farmers doing their part, however grim it was, the death tolls would have been even higher. Others claim that despite your hard work, it was only a matter of time before diseases like cholera and the plague ran rampant. Either way, you weren't just dealing with filthy conditions. You were doing your best to stave off the inevitable health disaster caused by years of neglect. The worst part was that most towns didn't even want to acknowledge the importance of your work. You were essential, sure, but society had a funny way of treating you like a necessary evil. Your job wasn't just disgusting. It was low. The stigma surrounding you as a Gong farmer kept you on the outskirts of social life. You were seen as part of the unseen world. You didn't get to sit with the other townsfolk, enjoying a warm meal and sharing stories at the local tavern. Instead, you were on the edge, handling the filth, keeping the town from sinking under the weight of its own waste, and dealing with a social status that could be described as less than desirable. You might be the one keeping things clean, but no one wanted to share a drink with you or have you at their dinner table. Most people saw you as something to avoid, a reminder of the unseemly side of life. They might have appreciated your work deep down, but that didn't stop them from giving you the stink eye or holding their noses when you passed by. You know what's crazy? Even when the need for sanitary workers like you was at its peak, you had almost no protection. There were no special outfits to protect you from the filth, no gloves to stop your hands from touching the refuse. And the idea of washing your hands after dealing with waste, well, that wasn't exactly a regular practice. So, imagine this. You spend your day elbow deep in some of the worst filth medieval society has to offer. And then you have to go back home and interact with people who have no idea what you've been doing. You might even go into a church to pray for strength to face the next day. And guess what? You were still treated like you had the plague, as if you could somehow spread your dirtiness to others just by being close to them. Historians still argue about the psychological and emotional toll of being a Gong farmer. Some think that the consistent stigmatization and social isolation were the most taxing aspects of the job. Others claim that the physical toll of the work, dealing with all that filth day after day, never getting a break from the smell, and always facing the threat of illness, was more devastating. Either way, it's clear that the Gong farmers of medieval society weren't just dealing with physical labor. They were dealing with a kind of social isolation that made the job even worse. But here's the thing, no matter how grueling the work was, no matter how lowly society made you feel, you were vital. The medieval world would have been in absolute chaos without you. Historians agree on this point. Without the Gong farmers, the streets would have been overrun with waste. Disease would have spread like wildfire, and the very fabric of society would have unraveled. So, even though you were treated like dirt, even though your life was far from glamorous, you played a role that was absolutely crucial for the survival of the medieval world. And in a strange way, that's your legacy. No one will write songs about the brave Gong farmers who kept the cities clean. No one will write epic tales of your heroic battles against the rats and the waste. But you were the ones who kept the wheels of civilization turning. It may not have been glamorous, but it was essential. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of what it was really like to be a Gong farmer in the medieval world. You weren't just a waste collector. You were part of a system that depended on you to ensure the survival of the city. You might not have been recognized for it, but the entire urban structure hinged on your ability to deal with what no one else wanted to handle. Let's talk about the toll on your body. We've already established that the job was dirty, dangerous, and socially isolating, but you also paid the price physically. After all, you weren't working in an air-conditioned office with an ergonomic chair and a latte at your desk. No, you were out there in the elements, exposed to the elements, and working in conditions that would make anyone gag. But even worse, you were constantly at risk of becoming sick in a time where hygiene was an afterthought, and the general understanding of disease transmission was almost non-existent. Just getting through a day without falling ill was a small victory. You'd spend long hours hauling waste from the cesspits. Those pits were deep, a dangerous, festering hole that grew with every contribution from the townsfolk. And once they filled up, well, that was your cue to scoop out the contents and start again. Think about it. You're crawling into dark, damp pits, surrounded by the stink of human waste, trying to remove something that's been festering for who knows how long. You'd need to haul bucket after bucket of human filth up to the surface and dump it in whatever designated spot you had, all the while trying not to get any of it on you. But, of course, that was impossible. Historians still debate whether medieval workers, including Gong farmers, were particularly more vulnerable to disease. Some argue that the constant exposure to human waste and filth was a primary reason why sanitation workers were often the first to fall ill during outbreaks. Others claim that the sheer number of people living in squalor meant that anyone could fall victim to disease, whether or not they worked with waste. But regardless of the debates, it's clear that your job was not the picture of health. Imagine your daily routine, spending hours in the muck, in the same clothes, never really getting a chance to wash up or rest. It's no wonder that diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and even the plague seemed to be one misstep away from catching you. Even beyond the physical exhaustion, there was the constant mental toll. You were working in isolation, not just because of the social stigma, but because the work was so unpleasant that no one really wanted to be around you. No one wanted to hear about how you spent your day or smell the lingering scent that stuck to your skin, even after washing your hands if you could. Of course, you were forever a pariah, kept separate from the rest of society, not just because of the stigma surrounding your job, but because your existence was a reminder of the dirty, inconvenient parts of life that no one else wanted to think about. Historians still argue about how much medieval workers like you were influenced by social and class structures. Were you simply stuck in a position based on your birth, or were there opportunities for upward mobility in this grim job market? It's likely that most Gong farmers were born into poverty, with little chance of ever escaping their fate. And while some may have had the option to switch professions, many stayed in the same role for most of their lives. But even if you were stuck, there was a strange kind of honor in it, wasn't there? You were keeping the town alive, keeping it functional in ways that the people around you couldn't, at least not without your grim service. You might have been surrounded by filth, but you were part of something vital. Without you, the whole system would have collapsed. Historians often overlook the importance of sanitation, especially in medieval times. You were literally handling the consequences of a lack of waste management infrastructure. Without you, disease would have spread even faster, and the towns would have been left buried in their own filth. Your existence, while undoubtedly miserable, was an essential cog in the machinery of life during those times. No, it wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Think about this. After hours of back-breaking labor, your task wasn't just to clean up. It was to dispose of waste in a way that wouldn't destroy the town's water supply or seep into the ground to cause more illness. You were tasked with managing the town's refuse, a responsibility that would be left to very few today. And even though you likely didn't get recognition for it, you were still part of something that kept the community alive. Literally. Historians still argue whether medieval society ever truly understood the importance of cleanliness and waste management. Some suggest that only after the Black Death did people begin to realize just how important sanitation was in keeping a city from falling apart. But at the time, all you knew was that you had a job to do, and you did it to the best of your ability. No matter how grim, no matter how dangerous, no matter how lonely, it was the ultimate paradox. You were the lowest of the low in society, yet without you, everything would have fallen apart. You were invisible, and yet you were essential. A thankless job, yes, but one that, if you did it well, kept the world functioning. And despite the dirt and the filth, There was a strange sense of pride in that, because, whether anyone else realized it or not, you were the one making sure that society didn't fall into chaos, despite the dangers, the social stigma, and the filthy nature of your work. The reality of being a gong farmer wasn't all about the struggle. It wasn't just about you slinging buckets of human waste through the streets while trying to avoid any bodily fluids from splashing onto your shoes. Sure, that was a significant part of it, but there was more to this life. A deeper connection to the medieval community that, believe it or not, no one really talked about. Let's talk about your role in the greater scheme of things. You weren't just cleaning up after the townspeople. You were preventing catastrophe. Without proper sanitation, disease could, and often did, sweep through towns at lightning speed. So, despite the gross job, you had an almost unrecognized power in medieval society. You kept the community from falling into ruin. Yes, you worked in the dirtiest of conditions, but you were also the one keeping the city from literally being quarried in its own waste. You probably don't hear a lot of stories about medieval towns that didn't have some form of sanitation. Sure, the historians tell us about the cities that thrived, the societies that developed sophisticated plumbing systems, but those were rare. The bulk of the population lived in places where you, as a gong farmer, were the last line of defense. Without you, things could have gotten much worse. Let's paint the picture. Imagine medieval life without you. Without someone going around cleaning the cesspits. There were no waste disposal trucks or sewage systems. Just you, your bucket, and your spade. The waste that you collected would sit there, rotting in the open. It would pile up in the streets, creating breeding grounds for bacteria. You'd be stepping around piles of waste every day. And it wouldn't just be an eyesore. It would become a public health nightmare. So, even though you weren't winning any awards for cleanliness, you were literally stopping the city from becoming a breeding ground for disease. That's a pretty big deal. Historians often discuss the ways in which the medieval world was prone to outbreaks of diseases like the plague, typhoid, and dysentery. And while these were devastating, they were also a harsh reminder of the state of public health. Without sanitation, the population was far more vulnerable to these kinds of outbreaks. And yet, no one ever talks about how vital it was for someone to take care of the guts of the town. The unsung part of life that everyone else tried to avoid. You were the one who bore that responsibility. Think about it. You worked through all seasons, too, whether it was the scorching heat of summer or the bitter cold of winter. You were out there, in the muck, making sure that the filth didn't pile up and flood the streets. And let's be honest, working with waste in freezing temperatures isn't just uncomfortable. It can be dangerous. The physical toll of your job was intense, and it didn't matter if it was snowing or if the ground was frozen. Somebody had to do it, and that somebody was you. But the most ironic part, even though your work kept the town alive, you remained invisible to most people. You'd walk down the street with your heavy bucket, and people would step aside, look away, or turn up their noses at you. you'd haul the waste through the town, and while some may have secretly appreciated the fact that you were keeping things from falling apart, no one was openly grateful. It was a lonely existence, but it was also necessary. You were the unsung hero, the one who ensured the community's survival. But you never received the credit you deserved. Historians argue whether the medieval world truly understood the value of sanitation in the same way we do today. While we might take it for granted now, the people of the past had to live with the consequences of their unsanitary habits until you came along. Some historians believe that it was only after the Black Death when the population began to realize just how much disease could spread through filth that sanitation started to be taken seriously. Others argue that people knew sanitation was important all along, but the systems they had were simply too rudimentary to make a real difference. Either way, the work you did was essential to maintaining any kind of order, and yet it remained a job you did alone, with little recognition. But despite everything, despite the dirt, the filth, the social stigma, you had a role that no one else could fill. The medieval towns may have been full of disease, waste, and disorder, but you, as a Gong farmer, were there to keep it from falling apart completely. And that's not something everyone can say. You were the forgotten keeper of the town's survival, the one who ensured that, even in the worst of conditions, things didn't fall apart. And when all was said and done, when the town was still standing, it was because of people like you, the ones who kept everything running, even when the rest of the world was too busy looking away. At this point, you might be wondering, why didn't you just leave? Surely there were other options, right? Well, unfortunately, as a Gong farmer, you weren't exactly swimming in opportunities. Medieval society had a pretty rigid social structure, and the idea of escaping your fate wasn't as simple as packing up and walking out. You were, for lack of a better term, stuck in a position that was as grim as the muck you worked with every day. To understand this, let's dive a little deeper into the class system that defined your life. You weren't just a worker. You were a member of the lowest tier of society, the peasants and laborers who were, quite frankly, considered expendable. The feudal system was deeply entrenched in medieval life, meaning that your options were limited from the moment you were born. For the vast majority of people in your situation, there was no real chance of moving up in the world. Even if you managed to learn a new trade or skill, there were few openings available in the towns, and social mobility was a distant dream. So, where did this leave you? Right at the bottom, stuck with a job no one else wanted. It wasn't like you could just decide one day to become a blacksmith or a merchant. You were the product of your circumstances, born into the lowest class, probably without much choice in the matter, and that was your lot in life. Some may have been born into the role of a Gong farmer, while others may have ended up in this line of work out of sheer necessity, forced to take what jobs they could to survive. And survive you did, even though society tried to make sure you didn't. You were the town's hidden worker, the one everyone relied on but didn't want to acknowledge. You might have spent your days digging through muck, but you were never rewarded with the status or respect that you deserved. The upper classes might have gone about their day, enjoying the comforts of their homes, while you toiled away in the filth. And if anyone asked about you, it was ever with admiration. Instead, you were more likely to be referred to with disdain, your job seen as essential but disgusting, a role that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Historians still argue about the structure of medieval labor and whether it was fair or whether people like you were simply stuck in a cycle that they could never escape. Some argue that the feudal system was designed to keep people like you in your place. No chance of rising above your station. No chance of changing your circumstances. Others suggest that there were more opportunities for movement than we think, especially in the wake of the Black Death, when the population had been decimated and there was more room for change. But the truth was probably somewhere in between. You were a laborer, sure, but you didn't have to stay a gong farmer forever. However, even if you did try to escape, the stigma of your job would have followed you. You couldn't just walk away from a job that was ingrained in medieval society as something other people did. So, there you were, stuck in your position, doing the job that nobody else wanted. You weren't living a glamorous life, and no one was singing your praises. But, in some ways, your role was crucial. You weren't just cleaning up the streets. You were ensuring that people could live and thrive in the town without having to worry about the diseases and dangers that unsanitary conditions could bring. You may not have been rich or powerful, but you were essential to the functioning of the community. The question becomes, then, why did you stick it out? Why didn't you run away and try something else? Maybe it was because you didn't have a choice. Maybe it was because, despite the filth, you were doing a job that, in the long run, kept people alive. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because the grind of everyday life had a strange way of making you numb. Every day was the same, one bucket after another, and there was a sort of rhythm to it that kept you going, even if it was gross, even if it was dangerous, even if it meant being socially outcast. You kept going, because at the end of the day, you had to. Historians still debate whether people in medieval society chose their roles, or whether they simply accepted the hand they were dealt. Did you ever dream of escaping the Gong farmer life? Or did you simply accept it as your fate? Some claim that people of the medieval lower classes were resigned to their roles, trapped in a system they couldn't escape. Others suggest that medieval people were more resilient than we give them credit for, and made the best of their circumstances. But for you, the Gong farmer, it didn't matter either way. Your role, whether chosen or forced, was essential to the survival of the community, and that was your place in the world, for better or worse. And honestly, maybe that's the real takeaway from the life of a Gong farmer. Even if society didn't respect you, even if your job was seen as the worst thing someone could do, you kept going. You didn't have the luxury of giving up. You had to survive, and you did. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't pretty. and it wasn't fun. But you kept things from falling apart. And in a world where things were always on the edge of collapse, your work was worth more than you could ever know. Now, as if your job wasn't grim enough. Let's talk about the public perception of your role as a gong farmer. This is where it gets especially tough to stomach, because despite the fact that you were doing work that was crucial for the survival of the town, no one actually wanted to see you or recognize what you were doing. You were an invisible figure, and not in a poetic, mysterious hero kind of way. More like the kind of invisibility that makes people look away when they see you coming. Imagine this. You've been out in the streets, trudging through muck, hauling filth, dealing with disease, and you finally finish your day. You want to go home, maybe take a quick wash though. Let's be honest, there's not much washing happening with the resources you had. And then you step into the local tavern or the town square. You can feel the eyes on you, the subtle recoils as you pass by. People whisper behind their hands. It's not that they hate you. Exactly. It's just that your very presence is a reminder of the ugly side of life. The side that no one wants to think about, but everyone relies on. You're a necessary evil. You're the thing that keeps the streets from becoming a cesspool of disease. But you're still that guy. Historians still debate the exact stigma attached to certain medieval jobs, with some arguing that laborers in the unclean professions, like the gong farmer, were regarded as untouchables. The idea of social outcasts existed, but how far that stigma went is still up for discussion. Did you face physical abuse, or was it just the quiet social exclusion that kept you on the outskirts of town life? One thing is clear. Your job came with a heavy price. And that price wasn't just in the form of physical labor or the risk of disease. It was also emotional. The isolation, the feeling of being regarded as less than human. The medieval world had its hierarchy, and you, my friend, were way down at the bottom of it. But what's strange is that despite being an outcast, you were still essential. You were the one who kept the place running. Think about that for a second. People might have ignored you, avoided eye contact, or held their noses as you passed. But without you, the streets would have been overrun with filth. You were the secret to keeping the town alive, even if no one wanted to admit it. There's an odd irony in that, isn't there? You were the invisible lifeblood of the town, the one who made sure the systems stayed in place. But no one gave you credit. No one celebrated you. You might have been the most essential worker in the town, and yet you were also the most despised. You were the very thing people needed, but couldn't bear to see. But you know what? Deep down, maybe you took some twisted pride in that. After all, you were needed. People could pretend not to care about your work, but in the end, without you, they would have been in much worse shape. Sure, they could pretend to ignore the mess you cleaned up. But the truth was, without the gong farmer, the town would have drowned in its own filth. You were the quiet enforcer of hygiene, the unsung protector of health. And without you, there would have been nothing standing between the townsfolk and an absolute disaster. The fact that no one thanked you, That was part of the job. It was a thankless role, but one you had to embrace if you were going to survive. And let's not forget the toll this all took on your mental well-being. Being socially ostracized wasn't just uncomfortable. It was damaging. When your work was as disrespected as yours was, it didn't just affect your social life. It ate away at your sense of self-worth. Every day, you were reminded that you were nothing more than a tool to keep the town from falling into chaos. You were the necessary, albeit disgusting, part of the system. But you weren't given a seat at the table. You weren't even given a chance to be human in the eyes of others. You were a walking symbol of everything that people didn't want to deal with: filth, disease, and the dark side of life. But at the same time, you were the one who made life possible for everyone else. Historians argue whether this kind of social stigma was unique to medieval times, or if it extended to later periods. Some argue that medieval people were more open about discussing these roles, and therefore, the Gong farmer might have been seen more as a necessary evil than an outcast. But others argue that, much like many unglamorous jobs today, the role of the Gong farmer was marginalized and buried under layers of shame. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. You were essential, but not seen. You were necessary, but not valued. And that's something that sticks with you long after the work is done. In a strange way, surviving the stigma was as much a part of the job as the labor itself. It wasn't just about digging through waste. It was about digging through society's judgment and finding a way to hold your head high, even when the rest of the world was doing everything it could to look away, as if the physical and emotional toll weren't enough. There was the ever-present threat of disease. Now, we've already talked about how working as a Gong farmer put you at the heart of medieval health risks. But let's dive a little deeper into just how dangerous your job really was. The thing is, medieval life was a constant battle against the spread of disease. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and certainly no understanding of how infections spread. You were walking through an invisible minefield every day, trying to avoid everything from the Black Death to simple stomach infections, all while elbow deep in some of the worst waste imaginable. Remember, the idea of germs didn't exist in the medieval mind. You weren't walking around with any awareness of why people got sick. Instead, they believed in miasma theory. This idea that diseases were caused by bad air that came from stagnant, rotting matter. And guess who was working with that rotting matter every single day? Yep, that would be you. Historians are still debating just how much the unsanitary conditions contributed to the spread of disease in medieval times. Some claim that disease spread so rapidly because people were living in close quarters with little understanding of hygiene, while others argue that the lack of knowledge about disease transmission only made the outbreak of the Black Death and other infections more deadly. In either case, you, the Gong farmer, were constantly exposed to the very thing that spread those deadly plagues. Every scoop of waste you removed was a roll of the dice. Would you catch something? Would you bring it back to your family? Would the next bucket of waste be the one that finally did you in? The worst part was the constant fear of illness. You knew the risks. You saw the effects of disease up close, as townspeople dropped dead from dysentery, typhoid, or worse. And yet, you had no choice but to keep working. After all, the cesspits were overflowing. The waste had to be dealt with. So, even though you knew that you were surrounded by dangerous bacteria and disease, you still carried on. Your livelihood depended on it. And if you stopped, the whole town would collapse into chaos. No one could afford to let you rest, whether you were sick or not. You were expected to keep working, hauling waste from one end of the town to the other. The toll on your body wasn't just about the work. It was about the constant exposure to disease and the fact that there were few, if any, safety measures in place to protect you. You had no gloves, no masks, no hand sanitizers. They didn't exist, and no way to avoid contact with the filth. The very nature of the job meant that you were getting sick at some point. You just had to hope it wasn't something that would kill you. Historians argue whether the high rate of sickness among medieval laborers, like Gong farmers, was truly inevitable, or whether there were ways they could have protected themselves. Some suggest that the nature of medieval cities, where people lived in close proximity to waste and rats, was a breeding ground for disease. Others believe that with even basic hygiene measures, the spread of disease could have been somewhat mitigated. Either way, the fact remains, as a Gong farmer, you were stuck in the middle of it all. Your survival depended not just on how well you could perform your job, but also on how lucky you were when it came to your health. And then there was the matter of the Black Death, the pandemic that struck Europe in the mid-1300s was the most devastating disease outbreak in history. It wiped out roughly 1/3 of Europe's population in just a few years. And as a Gong farmer, you were right in the thick of it. You didn't get to hide in your house, hoping the disease would pass by. No, you were out in the streets, cleaning up the waste and carrying the bodies of those who had succumbed to the plague. The disease itself wasn't picky. It didn't matter if you were a noble or a poor laborer. It killed indiscriminately. And as someone working in the very heart of the filth, your odds of survival were low. Historians still argue over the exact cause of the Black Death. Was it the bubonic plague? A bacterial infection carried by fleas? Or was it a more complex mix of diseases? Some argue that the lack of sanitation played a major role in the rapid spread of the disease. Others suggest that the major factor was the overwhelming lack of immunity among the population. But regardless of the cause, the fact remains: the Gong farmers were on the front lines. The very filth they were working with was teeming with the bacteria that spread the disease. As the plague spread, your role became even more important. The waste had to be dealt with. But this time, the bodies were piling up faster than you could haul them. Whole neighborhoods were wiped out, and you were left trying to keep up. with a rapidly escalating disaster. There was no time to process the fear, the panic, the bodies that piled up around you. Your job became one of sheer survival. You had to keep going. You had to keep working, even as the plague raged around you. In the end, you were part of the solution, but no one ever saw it. You were the invisible worker, essential, but forgotten. You didn't get to rest. You didn't get to be a hero. You simply had to keep going, day after day, through the filth, through the disease, through the risk of death, just to make sure that the city didn't collapse entirely. By now, the full weight of the life you've lived as a Gong farmer is beginning to set in. The filth, the isolation, the physical toll. It's a brutal existence, no doubt. But the strange thing about this life, as difficult as it was, is that there was some sort of twisted routine to it. You may have been constantly surrounded by waste, but in some ways, the job became your world. It was an odd sort of stability in an otherwise unstable time. The plague might have ravaged the town. Disease might have crept into every corner, but your job, well, that wasn't going anywhere. You spent your days working through the streets, day in and day out, hauling away the refuse that no one else wanted to deal with. It became a part of you, and in a way, it defined you. There was no luxury of escape, no possibility of a break from the stench and the filth. You didn't have the option to sit down and take a breather. You just kept going, hauling one bucket after another, dealing with the same grim task, day after day. Historians still argue whether medieval workers like you were ever able to take a moment to rest. Some suggest that the constant pressure of this work, with no days off, created a kind of mental exhaustion that was just as taxing as the physical labor. You weren't just physically isolated from others because of the stigma mentally. You were left to deal with your own thoughts, with the constant churn of your daily existence. You'd haul waste in the mornings, see the same familiar, disgruntled faces as you walked through the town, and then repeat it all again the next day. Your world was limited, narrowed down to the squalor that you were responsible for cleaning up. There was no time for leisure, no space for anything outside of the job. But let's take a step back and really think about why this job was so isolating. It wasn't just the physical labor or the social stigma. It was the nature of your work. You weren't just cleaning streets. You were cleaning up after people, after their most basic, private needs. You were exposed to their waste, their filth, their most unglamorous aspects. And in medieval times, that was something that made you an untouchable. The work itself kept you on the fringes of society, but it also made you the very thing that everyone else could never acknowledge. It's easy to see why people wanted to distance themselves from you. Your job was a reminder of what no one wanted to think, about what everyone was too busy to deal with. But what does that do to someone, mentally and emotionally? Historians still debate whether medieval society's treatment of laborers, like Gong farmers, led to a deep sense of resentment, or if people simply became numb to the isolation. Some think that the physical demands of the job wore away at the Gong farmers, while others argue that the mental toll was the hardest thing to deal with. After all, it's not easy to spend your entire day submerged in filth, constantly reminded that your work is seen as dirty by society. Over time, that kind of treatment eats away at you, right, despite the stigma. Though you had a job that needed to be done, there was no way around it. And while the rest of society went on with their lives, blissfully unaware of the filth piling up around them, you were the one who ensured they could live in what little comfort they had. It's a strange paradox. You were an essential part of life, but society rejected you for it. But here's the kicker. That sense of importance, though fleeting and unacknowledged by most, was your only consolation. You weren't in the spotlight, but you were needed. Without you, the very foundations of the town would have crumbled. The streets would have become impassable. Disease would have spread even faster, and without sanitation, the very fabric of society would have unraveled, and in a way that gave you a certain power, however invisible it was. And then came the Black Death. When the plague rolled into town, it didn't care about your social status, your job, or your position in life. It was coming for everyone, from the highest noble to the lowest Gong farmer. But for you, it meant one thing more work. The dead piled up faster than ever before, and with the city in chaos, you found yourself still doing your grim job, hauling bodies just as much as waste. And as the bodies piled up, your role only grew more critical. You were still out there, scooping up waste, hauling away the deceased, ensuring the town didn't drown in its own filth. But that's the thing about a pandemic. It makes everyone vulnerable. It doesn't matter how important you are, how essential your work seems to be. When the plague comes, it doesn't care who you are. It only cares about who can survive. And you, the Gong farmer, were still out there, trying to survive, trying to keep the town from turning into a graveyard. You might have been the one who kept things moving during times of peace. But it was in the face of the plague that your true role as a survivalist became undeniable. And yet, in the midst of the suffering, you were still marginalized. You still trudged through the muck and filth, never getting the credit you deserved. Always at the bottom of the social ladder, the plague ravaged the town, leaving its survivors to rebuild. But you were still there, as invisible as ever, doing the dirty work that no one else wanted to touch. Historians will forever debate the impact of workers like you on medieval society during the plague. Some argue that your work became even more critical, while others suggest that no matter how essential you were, your role would always be relegated to the shadows. Either way, your job was a constant presence, one that made sure the world didn't sink into complete ruin, even though you were the one who had to endure it all. As the plague begins to take its toll, you find yourself more entrenched than ever. The streets, once filled with bustling activity, are now eerily silent, save for the wailing of those mourning the dead. You've been doing the same job for so long that it's become second nature. The stench no longer hits you with the same force it once did. The constant danger of disease is just part of the routine now. But even so, it doesn't escape you that things have escalated to a level that no one could have anticipated in the early days of your work. It was manageable. The waste in the streets was a nuisance, yes, but it didn't always feel urgent. Now, though, it feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something worse to happen, and that something has happened. The plague is here, and it's sweeping through towns and villages like wildfire. It's taken the lives of more people than you could have imagined, and the streets that were once bustling with life are now littered with bodies. You might be the one cleaning up the mess, but the reality is that you, like everyone else, are not immune to the plague. You're out there, in the middle of it, hauling away the dead, dealing with the waste, and watching as your fellow townspeople drop like flies. You have no idea if you'll be next, but still, you keep working because there's no other choice. You've been doing this for so long, and now, in the midst of a global catastrophe, it's clearer than ever that your role is crucial. You may be a social outcast, looked down upon and forgotten by most, but when disaster strikes, you're one of the few who can still keep the wheels of the town turning. And it's in these darkest hours that you begin to realize something: you're more essential than ever. Despite being the person nobody wants to acknowledge, despite your role being one of the most thankless in all of society, you are the one who's holding things together when everything else is falling apart. There's a strange power in that, a quiet, invisible power. You're the one who's keeping things from descending into chaos, but nobody sees it. Nobody knows just how important your work is. The people you serve, the ones who give you the side eye as you haul waste from the streets, the ones who avoid your gaze as you pass by, are now in the same boat as you. They're just as vulnerable as you are to the disease, just as helpless in the face of a crisis that no one saw coming. The plague doesn't care about your status, your job, or your social position. It comes for you all. It sweeps through the town, bringing devastation to everyone in its path. And in a way, you can't help but feel a bit of dark satisfaction. The playing field has leveled, and you're no longer at the bottom of the heap. But there's no time for celebration. You can't afford to get lost in the idea of retribution or justice. You've got a job to do, and you can't let anything get in the way. The bodies need to be hauled. The waste needs to be cleared. If you stop, the disease will spread even faster. If you stop, the entire town will collapse. You can't afford to stop. Your survival and the survival of everyone around you depends on you continuing to do the work that no one else wants to do. And so you push forward. You dig deeper. You haul more waste. You bury more bodies. And while the town mourns the loss of its people, you, the Gong farmer, continue in your invisible, essential role, holding the pieces of society together. Historians still argue whether the labor of the Gong farmer was truly valued by medieval society. Some claim that in the wake of the Black Death, more people came to appreciate the importance of sanitation and waste management, while others suggest that those in your position continued to be seen as expendable. Either way, you were out there, in the thick of it, keeping the town from falling apart when things were at their worst. And in a strange way, that made you more powerful than anyone could have imagined. But despite this newfound recognition, even if it was only in your own mind, you still felt the isolation. You weren't invited to the gatherings in the town square, and people didn't thank you for hauling their dead family members. There was no parade to celebrate your hard work. There was no acknowledgement from the upper classes that you were keeping their city safe. You were still the same Gong farmer you had always been, the lowly worker, doing a job that no one else wanted. It didn't matter how critical your role was. It didn't matter that you were saving lives, or that without you, society would have crumbled. What mattered was that you were still on the outside, still looked down on, still ignored, still othered. And it didn't matter how essential you were. People still saw you as nothing more than the person who cleaned up after them. The plague has shifted everything, but the role of the Gong farmer, it seems, has remained unchanged. You're still out there, slogging through the streets, hauling waste, dealing with the consequences of a world that doesn't truly understand how fragile it is. But you keep going, because at the end of the day, that's what survival is, isn't it? It's not about glory. It's not about respect. It's just about pushing through, no matter what. As the plague continues to ravage the town, something odd starts to happen. Despite the horrors, despite the never-ending work, you begin to see the cracks in society's facade begin to form. The medieval social order, built on a fragile foundation of strict class hierarchies, starts to falter. Those who once looked down on you, the noblemen and women, the merchants, the guild masters, suddenly, they aren't so sure of their place in the world. The plague, this merciless force, doesn't care about rank. It strikes without warning, without prejudice. And this time, it's not just the poor and the sick who suffer. It's everyone. And in a strange way, you begin to realize that while you've always been invisible to society, you're more needed than ever before. The disease has come for everyone, regardless of how clean their homes are or how much gold they have in their vaults. No amount of social status can save you now. In fact, it's your very role as the one who deals with the waste, someone in direct contact with the filth that puts you at the center of the town's survival. While the wealthy are huddled inside their mansions, hiding from the plague, you're still out there, in the streets, doing your grim work. You're on the front lines of the crisis, yet nobody acknowledges the danger you're in, the hard work you put in to keep the town from descending into total chaos. No one thanks you. No one even notices you. You're still the outcast, the one who's forced to work with things others are too disgusted to touch. But now, more than ever, your role is critical. The city may have shut down, the market stalls may be empty, and the rich may be isolating themselves. But you, the Gong farmer, are the one who's keeping things from spiraling into utter destruction. Historians still debate whether the Black Death led to permanent changes in the class structure, or if society simply re-established itself after the pandemic passed. Some argue that the plague weakened the power of the nobility, as many died, leaving their estates without heirs or leaders. Others suggest that the social systems remained intact, only altered in the wake of so many deaths. Either way, the plague has a peculiar way of leveling the playing field, even if only temporarily. And for you, this means something. You're no longer the untouchable Gong farmer who everyone avoids. You're someone necessary for survival. But let's not get too carried away. The recognition you deserve never really comes. Sure, people might talk in hushed voices about the workers who are keeping things moving. But when the pandemic passes, it's back to business as usual. The city may remember how you kept it from collapsing during the worst of the plague. But once the disease has been defeated, or at least contained, they'll forget again. You'll still be relegated to the outskirts, still the outcast, still the person who deals with the muck, while everyone else pretends it never existed. And here's the thing, you're not entirely sure you'd want it any other way. After all, this job has become your life. You've lived through the worst it has to offer, and you've made it out the other side. In the process, you've built a strange resilience, something that others can't quite understand. They may have survived the plague, but they've only survived in the way people survive. Disasters. They've picked up the pieces and moved on. But you've lived the worst of it from the start. You've been face to face with filth, disease, and death, and you've come out the other side, still standing. No amount of recognition or social mobility can take that away from you. But the toll it takes on you mentally, that's something else entirely. You've seen the darkest corners of humanity, and in doing so, you've seen the darkest corners of your own mind. It's impossible not to let this work eat away at you, bit by bit. The constant exposure to disease, the stigma of your job, the isolation. It all weighs on your psyche, and while you might carry on, doing your duty, doing the work no one else wants to do, deep down, you're starting to wonder how much longer you can keep going. The people around you may move on, forgetting what you've done, but you'll never forget the horrors you've seen. You'll never forget the smell of death, the constant reminder that life is fragile, that in an instant, everything you know could be torn apart. And here you are, still standing, still doing the work, still invisible to the rest of the world. It's a strange existence, isn't it? To be both vital and disposable at the same time. But you've learned to live with it, to make peace with the fact that no matter what, you're never going to be recognized for the work you've done. You're never going to get the accolades or the applause that the other workers might. But at least, for a while, you had a purpose. You were part of something bigger than yourself. Something that, for better or worse, kept the town alive, even if no one ever acknowledges it. By now, you've probably started to accept the idea that your life as a Gong farmer is never going to be glamorous. It wasn't about recognition or reward. It was about survival. And in many ways, You were more of a survivor than anyone else in the town, while everyone else was busy rebuilding their businesses, their homes, and their lives after the plague. You were still working, still hauling buckets of filth. In fact, your work didn't stop once the plague was over. There were no days off for the Gong farmer. The waste still had to be dealt with. Medieval cities didn't have the luxury of modern plumbing. So even though the worst of the disease had passed, the dirty work was far from over. People may have forgotten you. Once, the worst of the plague passed, but you were still out there, handling waste, keeping the city from falling into chaos. After all, without you, the streets would have quickly filled with garbage and human waste, leading to even worse health issues. And while the town began to go back to its normal rhythm, you stayed at the edges, invisible but essential. It's a strange way to live, being so deeply tied to the pulse of the city's survival, yet always standing at its margins. You might have kept the town clean, kept it from turning into a breeding ground for disease, but nobody wanted to acknowledge the person behind the work. You didn't get any cheers. No, thank you. Banners after the plague passed. Instead, you just quietly slipped back into the background, doing your job without fanfare. The essential work of keeping society alive was something you did, but never got to feel proud of. Historians still debate whether medieval people even knew how important the work of people like you was. Were they aware that without people like you, the town could have collapsed under the weight of its own waste? Some argue that people didn't understand the connection between waste and disease, and therefore they didn't appreciate the job you did. Others suggest that the class system in medieval society kept your role invisible, even though it was indispensable. Either way, you were an essential part of keeping society from falling apart, but your contributions were rarely recognized. And then there's the question of what your life could have been if things had been different, if you'd been born into a different family, if the circumstances of medieval life had been more forgiving. Would you have had the chance to do something else, something cleaner, more prestigious? The answer is probably no. The medieval world wasn't kind to those who were born into poverty. You took whatever work you could find, and the grim reality is that your role as a Gong farmer was likely one you were stuck with. The class structure kept you in your place, and there wasn't much room for movement. But it's in this very survival that you find a strange form of meaning. You might not have been the person people looked up to. You might not have been the person who won awards or received thanks. But you were there. You were doing the dirty work that kept the town alive, kept the streets clean, kept the disease from taking over. Your work was the unsung foundation on which everything else rested. And in the end, maybe that's the most you can ask for. Not recognition, not respect, but survival. The knowledge that you did your part, that you kept the town from crumbling, even if it was all invisible to everyone else. Now, the streets are filled again. People are rebuilding. The markets are open. The homes are being repaired. But you're still here, still doing the same grim job, still a part of the system, even if no one recognizes it. And while you may not be remembered in the grand sweep of history, your survival is something that can never be taken away from you. Historians may debate your place in history, but there's one thing that's undeniable. Without the Gong farmers, without the laborers who worked in the filth and muck, the town would have crumbled long before the plague was even over. You were the ones who kept things moving, kept the streets from descending into chaos. And while no one was there to thank you for it, your role in the survival of the community is clear. It's not glamorous, it's not pretty, but it's essential. As the years pass, you may fade further into obscurity, but you've done your part. The town may never know your name, but without you, it wouldn't have made it through the plague. And maybe, just maybe, that's the way it was always meant to be. As the years drag on, life in the town begins to settle into a new routine. The streets, once filled with the heavy stench of waste and death, are now slowly coming back to life. Shops open, children laugh in the streets, and the familiar hum of daily life returns. But you, the Gong farmer, remain tethered to the past. The work never really stops. While the town celebrates its rebirth, you continue to carry the weight of what once was, the memories of the disease, the filth, and the destruction that came with it. You might be surrounded by the bustling life of the city, but you're always on the edges, out of sight, out of mind. The plague may have come and gone, but its scars are permanent for you. In the quiet moments, when the town is too busy with its rebuilding to notice, you're reminded of the days when the streets were lined with bodies, when there was no life left to save. Your hands still carry the ghosts of that time, the feel of the waste, the weight of the bodies, the stench that never really fades. The work is done, but it's never really over. Historians have long debated whether the Black Death truly reshaped the social fabric of medieval Europe. Some believe it forced society to evolve, creating new opportunities for the survivors, while others argue that the old systems of power and class persisted, albeit in a weakened state. But for you, as the Gong farmer, those debates mean little. What you know is that despite all the societal shifts, despite the plagues, despite the dying and the rebuilding, you're still here, doing the same job. Your position hasn't changed. You might not be carrying bodies anymore, but the muck and the waste haven't gone away. And while the town may be rebuilding, it still relies on people like you to keep things clean. The plague may have wiped out a third of the population, but it didn't change the way society viewed you. You were still a lower-class laborer. Your work might have been essential, but you were never going to be celebrated for it. You were never going to get the recognition that others received for their noble jobs, but you kept going because that's what survival is. It's not about the applause, the recognition, or the thanks. It's about getting through each day. You might have been invisible to the rest of society, but you kept things running, kept things from falling apart, even if nobody noticed. And even though you're still isolated, still looked down upon, you begin to realize something. The town might never recognize your contribution, but you know deep down that you were one of the ones who made survival possible. You were the one who kept the disease from spreading, the one who ensured that the streets didn't become overrun with waste and filth, while the merchants and nobles were huddled inside, trying to avoid the disease. You were still out there, working. You were the silent hero, the one who made sure the town didn't drown in its own decay. But no matter how important your role was, it was always the same. You were still the outcast. People still avoided you, still held their noses when you passed by. The stigma surrounding your work never fully left you. And yet, despite everything, you kept doing it. You kept going, because it had to be done. The town needed you, even if it didn't want to acknowledge it. Historians have often noted the psychological impact of surviving such a traumatic event as the Black Death. Some argue that the emotional toll of living through the devastation, especially for those in the lower classes, was far worse than the physical effects of the plague. After all, when you're constantly surrounded by death and suffering, it's hard not to feel the weight of it. The fear, the grief, the loneliness, it all builds up like the muck you used to haul. You may have survived the plague, but it left scars that would never fully heal. And those scars are part of you now. You might not have been able to change your position in society, but you learned something that most people never do. You learned the importance of resilience, of surviving. Even when the odds were against you, you learned that even when the world seems to crumble around you, there's a strange strength in just keeping going. You might never have had the luxury of being celebrated for your work, but you had the strength to endure. And that, in the end, was the most important thing. As time goes on, the town rebuilds. People go on with their lives, remembering the plague only as a distant memory. The streets are no longer filled with bodies, and the fear of disease begins to fade. But for you, the Gong farmer, the past is never really gone. The job you did, the things you saw, it all stays with you, haunting you, long after the work is done. And while society may have moved on, you know that you were part of something much bigger than yourself. You may never be recognized for it, but you were there when it counted. You were the one who kept the town alive. As time continues to pass, something begins to shift. Though it's subtle and almost imperceptible, the work is still as grueling, as necessary as ever. But there's a strange kind of resignation settling in. The town is thriving, slowly, and yet there's a part of you that feels disconnected from it all. The bustling market squares, the laughter in the streets, the return of normal life. It all seems to happen in parallel with your own life, but never quite with you. You've spent so much time on the fringes, isolated by your work and by the stigma that accompanies it, that it's hard to truly believe you're part of the world that's rebuilding itself as you walk through the now familiar streets. It's strange to think that life is moving on while you're still doing the same work you've done for so long. The plague may have killed thousands, but somehow it feels as if the disease of being forgotten is more insidious. People, the same people who relied on you to keep their town from falling apart continue their lives as though your work is somehow invisible. They've gone back to their shops, their homes, their families. They've moved on from the plague and from you. And while they might have more freedom, now, more opportunities, more hope, there's a gnawing feeling inside of you, an understanding that the world will never truly see you. They'll never know what it took to keep things going. And perhaps most painful of all, they won't care. And so, you keep trudging through the muck. The streets aren't as filthy anymore, at least not in the same way. You don't have to carry out the work in the face of a global crisis, but the work remains. The waste continues to pile up. And as long as you're the one with the tools and the strength to deal with it, you'll continue to shoulder that burden. But as the years pass, you start to wonder, will it ever change? Will you ever be free of this life, of this work that has defined you for so long? And the unsettling truth is that maybe it won't. The town has rebuilt, sure, but it's done so in its own image. The plague might have stripped society down to its core, but it also rebuilt on the same foundation of class and hierarchy. And once the dust settles, you're still in the same position, still doing the same job, still living the same life. Historians still argue about the long-term effects of pandemics on class structure. Some believe that after the Black Death, the lower classes gained more leverage, and that, over time, this led to a shift in power. Others suggest that once the worst of it passed, society fell back into its old ways, and the disparities remained unchanged. But for you, the Gong farmer, the difference doesn't matter much. You're not concerned with the political shifts or the changes in social mobility. You're concerned with surviving, and for now, that's all you have to hold on to. Maybe, eventually, society will recognize the value of your work, but you're not holding your breath. No one is likely to start singing your praises anytime soon. Instead, you keep doing your work silently, without complaint. You know your role, and you fulfill it, no matter how gross or thankless. And maybe, just maybe, there's a certain kind of pride in that, because in the grand scheme of things, survival is the ultimate victory. While others might move on, rebuild, and forget the sacrifices made, you're still there, doing the work. You're still a part of it, even if it's in a way that no one else can see. In the end, the job doesn't get easier. It doesn't get any more glamorous. But as the years go by, you start to understand that maybe this is your purpose. You were never going to be the hero. You were never going to be celebrated. But you kept the world from falling apart. And perhaps that's the most you can ask for. As the days turn into years, and as the town continues to grow, you realize that your role will never change. And that's okay, because even though you might never be recognized, you know that without you, everything would have collapsed long ago. And there's a quiet strength in that. The work you've done has kept the town standing, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. And maybe that's the greatest accomplishment of all. Now, it's just you, the ever-present muck, and the knowledge that your survival means more than anyone could ever understand.